the gap between what the expectation and understanding is at the top to what's actually happening in reality is pretty big in, I think, almost every company. The background to my career is quite a squiggly career, I guess, because a lot of it has been around technology. So 10 years at Microsoft, which is where I met my wife, who is now at Google. And then after Microsoft, I went into this startup land, which was a risky move. You know, I hadn't really planned this out particularly well, if I'm honest. And I had a friend that had started a company, and it was a Microsoft partner. So it was a consultancy company. And the idea was that you'd go into customers and you'd say, right, you bought this Microsoft stuff, let's help you use it because you're probably not using it to its full extent. Mm-hmm. There's a huge gap there, right, as you know from your background. And so we started to get into that, and we built this company together. And we went from like 5 people to 40, opened a Dubai office and all that stuff. It was really, you know, interesting, exciting times. But what I found was that I was just so much more interested in the psychology and the behavioral change side than I was actually the tech. Mm-hmm. And so I shifted and I decided to start this company, Craft Your Culture, about, what is it now? We're in November, so kind of February time this year. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess I'm still starting up and only 3 years in, but still struggle with like how to position it, because I guess like what I'm mostly interested in is like usually a cultural problem, but like all of my clients don't initially see that as a cultural problem. They're like, we just need training on Microsoft stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what do you think is going to happen after the training? Because if you're doing a half an hour long training session, probably nothing. It is like more like habits and, you know, changing the way things are done.
Yeah.
Habitually.
We found that we found that we had all these kind of models of change, you know, like Pro-Sci and Lenin and all this kind of different stuff. These models are great, and they have a format and a framework that you can apply then, and you can help an organization go through change. But I think success is ultimately determined by the culture at the organization that you're trying to serve. And so we work with some fascinating organizations, from AstraZeneca to Marks and Spencer's to, you know, lots of public sector ones as well. And it was really clear to me that you could tell quite early on, based on the culture of the organization, how likely you were going to be to succeed or not in each one. So it was fascinating.
Yeah. How did you find the public sector? Because I always sort of shy away from there a little bit, just because my preconceived ideas about how antiquated they are.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my career has been serving public sector customers, from education, government, healthcare, and that continued, you know, throughout Microsoft and afterwards. And it can be quite a frustrating experience, because you have, what I found in public sector, and the ratios I think are different in private sector, but there are pockets of excellence in public sector that are there, that could earn more money in private sector, but for a reason, either it's vocational or something like that, they stay within the public sector and they do their best to become, you know, a beacon and a force for change in their organizations. But they are fighting against the tidal wave in a lot of cases. And there's a lot of like legacy, I think, and history that makes it really hard for change to happen in public sector. You know, the way that hiring and firing works in public sector, often managerial and leadership positions are based on tenure rather than necessarily good leadership qualities and performance in that respect. And so it can make change quite hard in organizations. But when you do find those leaders that are special, that have a lot of those qualities and that can be a force for change in public sector, they are wonderful to work with. I think the difference in private sector is they have such a purpose around ambition that it's quite a clear direction, and you know if you're progressing well on that direction or not. And then I think lots of change can happen as a result of that can't or doesn't translate into public sector as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I always think of it as like if you go and sit in a hospital in NHS or sit in your GP or go to visit the council, it's like there's so much opportunity that you could see in even just in their like 10 minutes that the processes could be way better. But so that it feels like they need it the most, but then it's like it seems like they're the hardest, slowest oil tanker to change because it's just such a massive beast and there's so many like underlying issues that maybe you can't help solve. Seems like, strikes me as might be deeply frustrating that it's just so close to being great and it's so difficult.
No, it is, but I think it's true in any organization. I still think there's a huge gap between, if we're talking about ways of working, I still think there's a massive gap between what the leadership think is happening in their organization and then the reality when you get to frontline workers or the people, the individual contributors that are delivering a lot of the work. The gap between what the expectation and understanding is at the top to what's actually happening in reality is pretty big, and I think almost every company.
Yeah, I agree. I guess that's why I like to just go and speak to people that are doing the job rather than like, I don't know, I remember just when we put SAP in my corporate job, and then we had like millions of business analysts running around, like mapping out the process. And then, 2 years down the line, it's like, well, you said you did this process. Like, oh yeah, but we missed out the bit where Janine like downloads everything, puts it in Excel, and then spends hours like merging 2 bits of data, and then puts it over to Barry who does something else. It's like, well, you didn't tell us all that bit. So, no, because we just like that wasn't the process really. So it's like we have to go and speak. Like, what do you actually do and get an understanding? Yeah, I agree. It seems quite divorced, but I guess it's a tricky one. I don't know if you come across it in your role now in the cultural stuff of like that fine line between whether most managers actually know what their people do versus like getting too much into the detail. I don't know what challenges you come across in that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I mean the work that I'm doing at the moment is really focused around how do you design a culture that's intentional. I think what a lot of companies do is either they don't design a culture at all, and so they let the culture kind of happen in their organization, and that can feel really nice at an early stage organization like a startup scale up type of phase. But then you quickly come into problems when you start to go into SME land and you've got 100 employees instead of 10. That can feel really hard if you are not intentional about your culture. But the other mistake I think is made a lot is that kind of board exec level, they don't consider culture as much of a priority as they do the other health indicators that they'll assess regularly for their organization, like profitability or revenue or users or whatever it is that they're measuring for whatever industry they're serving. And so what they do instead, through that lack of understanding, is often delegate it to HR or a typical, department such as that, which is not the right place for it to sit. HR can do a great job around designing a culture that maximizes how employees feel at an organization. But if that responsibility is delegated to them, it's not a top table priority, and it has to be. Culture has to be a top table priority. And then what you'll see, and I think we've seen this in the tech industry over the last couple of years, if it is delegated out, if it's not considered a top table priority, then all the nice things that you see around culture, like well-being, mental health, diversity, inclusion, that can be perceived as nice, but are actually critical and essential to the success of a company, those things can fall by the wayside when times are hard. And those organizations, especially the tech industry, have made loads of layoffs over the last 2 years. And I'll be interested to know how many of those people are salespeople bringing in the money, or engineering delivering the product, versus people leading sustainability initiatives, for example, for their organizations. I think that will be an interesting data point to look at. So I think one of the big areas that I focus on now is how do you design a culture that matches the ambitions of the company. If the company wants to grow and triple in size over the next 5 years and meet profit goal X, revenue goal Y, market share goal Z, or whatever, then I think you start from that, and then you work back and you say, well, what are the behaviors that you need from your people to achieve that? Then you design the culture from there. And in most organizations, what that will nicely mean for them is that will depend on the cognitive ability of their people. And so you create an environment that elevates the cognitive ability of their people to its maximum and how they work
Mm.
together as a team. And
Mm-hmm.
that should feel really good for employees and will lead to those ambitions that the company has. But I think a lot of companies miss that it has to be designed from the ambition. It has to be a top table priority, and it has to stay at that level as you embed and you evolve that culture over time.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. I always think of it like, because I'm trying to get more referrals through like managed service providers, and I guess they're used
Mm.
to just having a monthly recurring fee or bringing in like contractors on a day rate. And they was like, well, what's your day rate? I'm like, well, I don't really have one because I should be focused on results. And if you do a day rate, then like I'm immediately morally opposed to the client because it's like, well, it's in my best interest to stay longer, and it's in
Mm.
their best interest that I take less time. And on the flip side, it's like, well, I could spend a day doing something that takes someone else 10 days. So then I'm now shortcutting myself. So it doesn't work for either party. I always think, well, even if I did charge by the day, it's like, well, when am I going to bill you? Because if I think of like the best solution for your
Mm.
situation whilst I'm on the toilet, I was like, am I billing you for the time on the toilet? I was like, if I go in the shower and think of a great solution, am I billing you for the 10 minutes in the shower? What if I think of it overnight? It's like, do I bill you for the 8 hours that I'm asleep? Because it just came to me like whilst I was sleeping or going for a run. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting to like link it to go through those steps to link the senior leadership team. So, look, it's the cognitive ability that's going to get you the results. How can you free up people to have more time to get a good solution? I think that's an interesting way to pare it down for people.
I think it has to be right. I mean, I think we're not living in an age where we're paid for our physical ability in most cases. We're not great at, I don't know, digging holes or making things out of wood, or we're not paid for those kind of skilled manual labor, pre-industrial revolution types of jobs. We are paid for our cognition. That's what the
Mm,
value that we bring. But I think we're actually still measured and motivated in ways that are very traditional and kind of go back to when we did have the industrial revolution, and it was about kind of repetitive routine, kind of Henry Ford style ways of work. But I think that's
mm,
changed a lot now, and I don't think organizations have caught up with that. But the reality is the successful organizations are the ones that do think about how do we enable our people to cognitively perform at their best as much of the time as they're with us as possible. I think that's
mm,
what it comes down to. We're trying to solve problems now that haven't existed before. We're trying to work at a pace that we've never had to work in before, with a level of disruption that's just getting faster and faster. And all of that requires complex problem solving and thought. And therefore it's cognitive ability.
mm. Yeah, I guess maybe up to now, like there's some knowledge workers that are probably more like the industrial age, like doing machine. Like just thinking back
Mm.
when I started in as finance business partnering, it's like you are a bit like a production line of like you're not churning out widgets out of a machine, but you're like doing reports in Excel or the stuff that's quite manual. And I'm sure lots of bigger companies have outsourced some of that, like my last corporate job, to then say, well, that, we don't want to do any of the lower down stuff. We'll outsource that, and we'll want everyone to think. But then, like you say, they're not then valuing the thinking stuff. And what actually happens is like no one values the outsource bit, and then some of the work comes back into someone that's higher paid, so they're still just churning out the same stuff. But yeah, I guess when I think about like people saying worried about AI taking over their job, it's like, well, that
Mm.
can only be true if you're not really getting value out of your thought, because actually it should be empowering that now, like, whatever you think of, you can get AI to do for you, rather than the other way around, like taking your job away. I guess that's only true if you're more like the widget producer of knowledge
Yeah.
work rather than the thinker.
There's so,
um,
so many so many conversations now are kind of combining those things together. I'm finding anyway, where companies are asking me like culturally, how do we get ready for AI, which is, interesting given that it's already here. There's nothing to get ready for. It's landed. It's
Yeah,
been
yeah.
it's been here and now it's in everybody's faces. But I think that's interesting to think about how a company shifts their mindset like that and considers this is such a disruptive and unprecedented thing almost. Like how do we
Mm,
prepare ourselves for that? And so many of the conversations I'm having are those two things smashing together at the moment.
mm. Yeah, I think it's just brought what's already been going on probably to a faster conclusion. Because I guess when I
Mm,
was in my corporate job doing financy stuff, it's like, well, if I've spent the time to try and make my job be able to be done in like half an hour, because I've like spent ages learning Excel myself and doing loads of models and making it so you can just click a button and everything's done. I thought,
mm,
well, why am I getting penalised? Like, why can't I just go home at 9:30, come in at 9, do my thing? It used to take me 7 hours, and now it just takes me half an hour.
mm.
So who gets that time back? It's a bit of a tricky one, and I guess AI is going to brought those sort of conversations to a head. It's like, well, it used to take hours and hours to do this report, presentation, whatever, and now AI, can you just do this for me? Dealing, well, yeah, that looks about right. I'm done. It's going to be interesting times, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and how companies respond, I think, will be fascinating, right? Because I think my early impressions are that I think there's like a spectrum of response to this, and there's like a kind of a fear-based control level of response where you're an organization saying, we're worried about our data getting out, we're worried about people misusing this and X, Y, and Z happening. So we're going to try and lock down, control access to it and all this kind of different stuff. I think that's one end of the spectrum. And then you've got almost the other end where you can go too far the other way and you can say everything must be rethought of and reinvented using AI right now. And people are in that organization would be almost targeted on how they can use AI to do things differently. And it's kind of forced upon everybody. And I think where organizations land on that spectrum, I think will really determine how successful they be, because there's a lot to consider in
Mm,
how they get this right. You need people to feel like, I think, my opinion, for what it's worth, is that you need people to feel open to experiment
mm,
and to find these things themselves. Nobody's going to know all the answers in an organization to this. You're going to find a new AI tool every single day that could probably have some value in how it does your job. And if you've got people that feel like they can experiment and they can try and they can find new things and they feel motivated and empowered to do that, that's a great starting place. How
mm,
that then manifests across the organization and how that translates to things like you just described, where you've got a very specific set of tasks and things to do in your role, and suddenly something that took you 7 hours, you might find a way yourself to do that in half an hour through you experimenting with AI. How that manifests itself across an organization will be really interesting. But the big gains, I think, will be made by the companies that think about their response on that spectrum and then intentionally land somewhere that is well thought out with the right kind of direction in mind.
mm. Yeah, I've always been a big proponent of having time to noodle. So I always think good things come out of having enough time to like just, oh, I wonder what happens if I play around with this. And I guess I always had the thought of, which I've said on a recording before, of an old lecturer that was like, if you always try to work yourself out of a job, you'll never be without a job. So that's always been my sort of mindset, culture of like always trying to do whatever you're doing now quicker. And I guess AI is just accelerating that. But yeah, it's going to be interesting.